We're excited to be joined now by Representative Bob Good of Virginia, who was recently elected as the leader of the Freedom Caucus, which has a huge amount of leverage, obviously, going into the new year as the House resumes its business in the new year. So, Congressman, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
I want to start with that first question. I mean, we still have the one-person motion to vacate. That rule is still in place, which is obviously a huge piece of leverage that the Freedom Caucus has over Mike Johnson. You were certainly part of how that was used against former Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Going forward, what is the red line for the Freedom Caucus on Ukraine with Mike Johnson? Are you in conversation? Are you in contact with Mike Johnson? And what is the red line for you on Ukraine on the border as Mike Johnson negotiates with House Democrats and Mitch McConnell on the Senate side?
Well, if I may, just since you mentioned the motion to vacate, that's something that's been in place for the better part of 200 years, going back to the Thomas Jefferson days until Nancy Pelosi changed it. When we were able to negotiate or leverage support for the Speaker for a new House rules package, a new Republican conference rules package that would restore regular order and empower individual members instead of the elites controlling it. Part of that was to restore that accountability measure that a Speaker serves at the pleasure of 218 members. So frankly, that is restored to empower all members to hold the Speaker accountable. Even the minority can try to utilize that. And every Speaker serves, again, at the pleasure of 218 members. One would hope that we would never reach a point where we'd have to do that again. But I will just point out, I think we're in unprecedented times as a country. We've never had this level of debt. We've never had this level of a monthly deficit. We've never had our credit downgraded twice like it has been this past year. We've never had the debt to GDP. We've got 40-year high inflation, 20-year high interest rates. Then you've got the border invasion. I mean, we've never had a president intentionally harm the country the way this president is with facilitating this border invasion. You've got unprecedented trampling on our constitutional freedoms and liberties with FISSA surveillance. There's so many crises, the weakening of our military, the war on American energy, affordable, reliable energy, the climate, environmentalism, extremism. So like no time before, must we stand up and deliver for the American people and validate the faith and trust they placed in us when they gave us the majority a year ago. And so far, we failed to do that. That's why some of us are willing to do whatever it takes to try to bring transformational change to Congress. That said, you asked specifically about Ukraine. Yes, we're in regular contact with the Speaker, and certainly I've had conversations with him and interaction with him to a greater degree since I was elected as the incoming chairman of the Freedom Caucus. But his position is, and I think will remain, and we're certainly encouraging him to that effect, that Ukraine is dead on arrival. Support for Ukraine is dead on arrival in the House until if and when the Senate passes H.R. 2, our outstanding, strong border security bill that the House passed months ago, and the president signs it into law. And not until we have that done and we begin to see measurable metrics, demonstrated performance on securing our border, would we even talk about support for Ukraine? And if that was to even be considered, it must be paid for, which is unprecedented. We don't pay for supplementals in this town. It must be paid for and offset. It must have accountability, transparency. It must have a strategy attached to it for a defined limit to U.S. involvement. All of those things to even be considered. I'm unlikely to support it irrespective of those things, but it can't be brought to the floor of the House. We can't trade our border security in a phony way, a phony version that comes out of the Senate that pretends to secure the border. We already have the good legislation. The Senate must sign it, pass it rather. The president must sign it. It must become law. It must be enforced, and by a lawless administration who to this point is breaking our laws and purposefully facilitating this border evasion that is doing irreparable harm to the country.
So is that a motion? Would you move to vacate Mike Johnson if he plays ball with McConnell and Democrats on Ukraine over the border?
Well, similar quick answers. We're not trying to obviously vacate our Speaker. I believe he's a conservative. I believe he's an honest guy. I believe that he loves the country. I believe that he wants to do the right thing. That said, this is not personal. It wasn't personal with the previous Speaker. It's not personal with this Speaker. This is performance-based. And I will just note that I got asked for months from January to September about motion to vacate with the previous Speaker. And I said, hey, we're focused on trying to bring change. We're trying to advance conservative policy. We're trying to influence the conference to stand up and deliver for the American people. We're not just flippantly or cavalierly just flowing around threats to motion to vacate. I didn't talk about that until we got to the point when it happened. I didn't talk about that. And certainly, and that's not an inference that, hey, that we're in the same place. The current speaker inherited a very difficult situation. There's a reason why we have a new speaker. And, we put him in the fourth quarter when we're down 35-0 and we've lost 10 games in a row. That's the Republican Party that's failed to deliver for the American people. That's failed to show the demonstrated willingness to fight and to draw and enforce red lines that we're going to stand and fight for the American people instead of caving and surrendering as we have done for the last 30 years, I would suggest. So that's what we're working is to try to help the speaker to get the conference to stand behind him and be willing to have a fight over funding this government and cutting spending year over year, to be willing to have a fight to reform FISSA surveillance so we don't continue to trample on the constitutional freedoms and rights of the American citizens, that continue to have a fight or be willing to have a fight to secure the border. What are we willing to do, or what are we prepared to do to achieve that? And then to continue to fight to keep Israel aid as a standalone package that's paid for, that isn't hijacked, utilized to hijack support for Israel and tying it to Ukraine. That again, we will not consider aid to Ukraine until this border is secure. Not talked about being secure, not promised to be secure, but actually is secure. So that's where we are. We're trying to influence the right things and trying to work with our speaker when he's right. And encourage him to do the right things, but then to challenge him when he's wrong, when we don't think he's doing the right thing. And I think that the demonstration of that is we were adamantly opposed to the continuing resolution that passed. We were adamantly opposed to the NDAA that didn't have the good policy reforms in it and was negotiated secretly in the back room between House and Senate leadership instead of a true conference committee, and worse, attached the FISA surveillance extension without the necessary reforms to protect Americans.
Mm-hmm. We do want to get into that FISA extension in a moment, but I'm curious, why does Israel aid deserve kind of a clean up or down vote, whereas Ukraine aid ought to get tied to HR 2? What's the difference there? It feels like we're talking war and peace. Each ought to get an up or down vote. Yeah.
Great question. And I would just point out that one of the many things that's wrong with Washington is that you try to avoid too often we've tried to avoid tough votes and protect members from taking controversial votes and being on record for what they stand for or against. So you package things together that aren't necessarily related. So in other words, it's like the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is 75% a welfare bill. But you know what? We don't vote against farmers. You got to vote for the welfare package. Or if you're a Democrat who wants the welfare package, then we sort of use that to get you to vote for the farmers. Instead of having both of them separated and stand alone on their own merits or lack thereof, so we can reform and improve both of those instead of putting them together. Same thing with, Ukraine aid has nothing to do with Israel aid. Or nothing to do with humanitarian assistance for Hamas, or nothing to do with Taiwan, or nothing to do with disaster relief. This $110 billion package that the president and the Senate want us to pass together. So the speaker was right, and we certainly encourage him to do that shortly after becoming speaker, because the American people and the Congress overwhelmingly support aid to what I would consider one of our top 2 or 3 allies in the world, Israel. And for a number of reasons, Americans and the Congress overwhelmingly supports that. So let's consider Israeli aid without controversy in and of itself on its own merits. And it passed with every Republican, I think, except one in the House, and 12 Democrats. It was paid for by cutting Biden's IRS expansion, because Israel is not bankrupt as a country. They are not fiscally unstable like we are as a country. They don't have $34 trillion in national debt, so we ought not to borrow from our kids and our grandkids. We can pay for it by reducing Biden's IRS expansion, which is breaking the mold of borrowing more and exacerbating our debt situation for a supplemental, which is by design, it's never paid for.
Right, but real quick though, doesn't that increase the deficit to cut back on tax enforcement?
No, it doesn't, because you've got, again, Biden's trying to spend $80 billion to hire 87,000 new IRS agents to go after, harass, intimidate, threaten regular income Americans who are audited at 5 times.
Right, but that stuff works. Like people, right?
The American people don't need a more oppressive, more powerful IRS going after them, especially when the IRS has been demonstrated, like many of our federal agencies, to be political in its nature on who it goes after and who it doesn't. And again, we're bankrupt, so we can't afford an expansion of the IRS. The American people aren't paying too much in taxes. The government is spending far too much. We've got a spending problem. We don't have a revenue problem in this country.
So one thing I wanted to ask about is the comments Marjorie Taylor Greene made to CNN. And the only reason I'm asking about it is because, again, just to emphasize, the Freedom Caucus has a huge amount of leverage going forward in the new year, in the new Congress. And, from the perspective of a conservative, we'll hopefully be calling some shots going forward. And Marjorie Taylor Greene is claiming that your chairmanship, your impending chairmanship of Freedom Caucus is hurting fundraising, that your endorsement of DeSantis over Donald Trump has hurt unity in the Freedom Caucus, et cetera, going forward. Is there any truth to any of that? And is it true that that sort of Trump-DeSantis divide and potential fundraising issues are hurting the Freedom Caucus's ability to sort of work together as one unit that's able to call shots kind of cohesively with all the leverage that it has in the new year and a very slim margin of a majority in the House and the motion to vacate back in place?
That's a long question. Let me take a stab at it.
Thanks.
Marjorie Taylor Greene has demonstrated that she'll say anything to smear or attack or lie about those to whom she has a personal vendetta or a grievance against. Marjorie Taylor Greene showed herself to be the fraud that she is when she unconditionally supported the former speaker a year ago. And then, of course, she got lots of blowback against her because she had positioned herself as a brand of somehow anti-establishment and a change agent in Washington. Then she unconditionally supported the former speaker. That was obviously very unpopular with her base. She then smeared and lied against those of us who were fighting to change or to prevent the former speaker from getting elected back in January. She was then subsequently kicked out of the Freedom Caucus because of her behavior. So she knows very little about the Freedom Caucus. She is an island to herself now. She was kind of a useful idiot at the hands of the former speaker back in January to try to help him become speaker. Now she's kind of isolated herself. She has no support among the membership. And so she lies and smears and attacks others. The Freedom Caucus board overwhelmingly elected me as chairman. The general membership overwhelmingly elected me as chairman. We, as a Freedom Caucus, continue to fight for the conservative principles that the Republican Party is supposed to stand upon. We are the anchor, the conservative conscience of the Republican majority in the House. We're willing to challenge our own leadership when we're wrong because we don't work for them. We work for our constituents and those who elected us.
Did she have any support inside the Freedom Caucus during that debate? I don't quite know how the Freedom Caucus internal stuff works, but was there anybody that was like, no, she's great?
I won't get into the internal dynamics of it. I'll just say that there was an overwhelming decision to remove her from the Freedom Caucus, and I guess she's got an axe to grind as a result of that.
Going back to the FISSA fight that you talked about earlier, there was some hope that there would be a kind of progressive caucus, Freedom Caucus alignment on this issue that would be able to kind of roll back some of these surveillance authorities. You guys seem to get steamrolled at the very end, and as the NDAA was going through the House, I think you needed, 146 votes to be able to stop it from getting the 2/3 majority to go through to kind of force the spy masters back to the table to negotiate the surveillance authorities. You guys fell short by a couple dozen votes. What went wrong, and what can the Progressive Freedom Caucus coalition, if it exists, do differently when this fight comes back in the spring?
Well, the American people don't want FISSA extended without the reforms to protect them. We can't have warrantless searches of U.S. citizens where you don't have to go before a judge with probable cause and get permission, if you will, validation for the reason to surveil or spy upon U.S. citizens. So they want us to reform FISA. They don't want it extended without that. It was terribly disappointing that we would do that we would attach it to the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which didn't have the policy changes that we had voted for in the House last summer. It frankly extended the Biden-Pelosi-Schumer vision for the military. And it was an NDA that we overwhelmingly rejected from a Freedom Caucus standpoint. It received 4-1 support from Democrats, 2-1 support by Republicans, and so it ultimately passed. But I think it was a mistake, and I think it was a mistake to extend FISA surveillance. It's extended until April. We'll have another crack at that to bring reforms into place early in the new year, and I certainly hope that we will do that.
And we talked about Israel and its funding for Israel earlier in this interview, and I wanted to ask you why it is. And I'm curious, just from the left, it seems like the America First kind of movement that has really surged over the last several years and has influenced the way that the right has kind of interacted with Ukraine funding and support for the Ukraine war, doesn't seem to translate when it comes to Israel. Like, why is that?
Well, Israel has long been a historic ally of the United States, certainly in the 75 or years so since Israel became a nation in 1948. Israel is a key ally. It's the only true democracy in the Middle East. It is surrounded by nations who want to destroy it and push it into the sea. Israel has every right to defend itself, do whatever is necessary to defend its national sovereignty. It's a key U.S. ally. And again, it's overwhelming support by in the Congress and among the country. And so I believe similar to the United Kingdom, it's one of our true, few, real, genuine allies that stand with us through thick and thin, and we ought to stand with Israel.
And yesterday, and we played this clip earlier in the show, I was at the State Department briefing, and I asked the State Department spokesperson, Matt Miller, about comments made by the Pope just recently, where he was talking about the IDF attack on the Catholic Church in Gaza, and he described it as it's terrorism. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what does it say about kind of the U.S. role on the international stage and its alliance with Israel, which you've said one of our closest allies? If even the Pope is willing to describe what we're supporting in Gaza as terrorism,
or one incident.
Yeah, that incident. And is there a point at which members of the Freedom Caucus start to say, this is actually harming our national interests?
Well, I didn't see those comments, and I'm not familiar with what you're referring to specifically as it relates to the Pope. However, I believe that Israel does its best, the best that it can in a wartime situation to protect civilian casualties and to protect innocent victims. There's a reason why they were willing to have that temporary pause in operations to try to, from a humanitarian standpoint. But they're dealing with an enemy that has said they do not have the right to exist and is willing to kill children, to burn children alive, to rape and kill women, to kill senior citizens, to put people in ovens, to cut off their heads. This is an unbelievable evil that they have to defeat. And frankly, it's an evil that's willing to use schools and mosques and churches and hospitals and so forth to shield their military operations, to use their own citizens, Palestinian citizens, individuals as shields against what they're doing. So Israel's in a tough situation, obviously, but Israel needs to do whatever is necessary to defend itself and to prevent something like this that happened on October 7th from happening again in their country.
I have one more question, sort of from a broader 30,000-foot view. Why is it, you've seen a lot of this up close, and I know a lot of average Republican voters who are outside of Washington, D.C., maybe in your district in Virginia, who look at what happens in Washington, who look at what happened with the NDAA, which was just shameful, but also shameful in that it was so typical of the way business works here in D.C. Why is it that so many elected Republicans in D.C. vote against their voters? Why is it that they are so willing over and over again to sort of put their priorities, the priorities of their lobbyists, of special interests, above what their constituents say they want, and then they get to D.C. and do something contrary to that? You've seen it up close. What's your sort of perspective on why that happens?
There's an interesting dynamic in D.C. and in Washington, and I do say in elections generally. Democrats will run as moderates, and then when they get into office, they vote as radical leftist communists in lockstep. I mean, there's no difference between...
Nice.
They vote like Ryan.
Yeah.
There's no difference between the way AOC votes, for example, and those Democrats who claim to be moderates. Find me the daylight between them on anything substantive in Congress, and they're 99% in lockstep. Republicans tend to run as conservatives, but then they get to D.C. and they often behave as moderates. It's a very different dynamic, and it is contempt for seemingly the voters, the grassroots, the base, those who elect them. They get to Washington, sort of a we know best mentality. You don't understand how Washington works. And Republicans seem to think that the way to the majority and the way to winning in Washington is to moderate, to work with Democrats, to compromise, but they don't run on that, but that's what they do. And you've got about a third of Republicans in the House, I would submit, who are willing to fight for genuine conservative principles, to do what they said they would do, to buck their party leadership when it's wrong on something like the NDAA and the FISSA extension. But unfortunately, you got about 2/3 who are willing to do what leadership says, to kind of just be a team player no matter what the play call is, who really don't want to limit government or cut spending or make the tough choices or do the things that they run on. And unfortunately, that's reflected. And that certainly makes it difficult for the American people to trust us with leadership, with the majority, with the ability to govern if we don't deliver on the things that we said we would do.
Representative Good, you have been so generous with your time. We went long because it was so interesting, but we thank you so much for coming and talking to us a little bit about HFC's plans for the new year, and we hope to talk to you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
All right, that does it for us on today's edition of Counterpoints. We certainly hope everybody has a very Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year. We'll see you back here in January. Don't forget to subscribe, get a premium subscription, maybe as a holiday gift to yourself.
There you go. Yeah, you earned it.
All right, we'll see you all soon. Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.